Good morning, and we are now in Senior English B, where we are involved in an continued investigation of the poetry of John Keats, the great Romantic poet. Today is my ambition to try to work through two of Keats's oeuvre. The first will be the poem on 884-885, When I Have Fears That I May Cease to Be, the second of the Keatsian sonnets that we're looking at. And then the second will be the first of two odes that we'll look at, Ode to the Nightingale, and then in our next session we'll talk about Ode on a Grecian Urn, so that we will have looked at four of the Keats offerings. I want to begin with When I Have Fears That I May Cease to Be. So you should be with me now on 885. The first thing I want to point out about this is just to remind you that Keats his poetry can best be understood through his biography. If you had to jot down one thing in your notes real quickly about Keats's biography that sticks in your mind, what is that from yesterday that's most interesting? Yeah, he dies early. That's going to be, you can't talk about Keats without talking about the fact that he died barely 25 years old. He was very young. We should say it out loud though, he knew he was dead long before his death, right? He knew when he went to Rome, he knew that it's over. Today, you can go to Rome, and right there beneath the Spanish Steps in that little room, you can see what's now been turned into a Keats museum. That's the room where he died, and then of course later buried in Rome itself. You can also go to his tombstone. He dies in Rome, but he knew he was gone long before. One of the ways we know that is the poem that we'll look at here. But I want to begin real quickly at 3b, and I want to ask an interesting question. I think it's an interesting question. Many of my students have as well found it an interesting question. If last night you were sitting in a hospital room where a doctor came in and said to you, I've got bad news. By June 1, it's over for you. By June 1, it's over. We found lesions on your brain. We could try to do some surgeries. But the reality is if we cut you open, we might kill you right away. The reality is this is untreatable for the most part. June 1, it's over. You're done. And of course, we're familiar that on the planet yesterday, a few hundred people on this planet got that news. Right? And today, a few hundred more will get that news. We're familiar with that, right? The ubiquitous effect, the negative effect of cancer, especially brain cancer. We're familiar, right? Question for you. After the immediate shock and horror of knowing that you didn't have much time, June 1, you'll be dead, what would you do between now and then? This is a 3B question. I'm interested in you writing something down. What would you do? I'll ask some guiding questions for you. Because sometimes students are like, dude, I don't even want to think about this. Yeah, but think about this for just in the abstract for a moment. If you knew you were going to be gone by June 1, for example, would you have been here today? Like, for example, would you stay in school? Or would you just drop out? I think I shared with you a student of Worland High School who I knew, who had a very similar kind of prognosis, and she said, drop out. Why would I drop out? Before I die, I want to prove that I finished what I started. No dropping out for me. Interesting. Other students report, I'm way wrong answer here. I would drop out immediately. And then my next question is to do what? Can you list 3 things you do before you die? Now, this doesn't have to be as dramatic as you'll be dead by June. But if you had to write down 3 things you'd like to do before you die, what are those 3 things? Okay? What are those 3 things? 3 things that maybe you haven't done, that you would like to do? 3 things that you look at and you say, before I go, I'd at least like to know that I tried or I did this thing or that thing. Write down real quickly what that is for you. Some of you will point out, it's such a hard question because I'm so young. Right? By the way, I've had students who make this list, and then many years later, in a box somewhere, going through all their old stuff, discover their old high school annotations, and they're much older, and they see this list, and the list is actually written as, and I'd recommend you write it down this way, 3 things I want to do before I die, 1, 2, and 3, and then literally write down something real quickly. Coming back to a list like this in 30 years could be fascinating. For some of us, can I just help? For some of us, in your list, there will be travel involved. See, this is always a fascinating. If there's one city in the world you'd like to see before you die, what is that? Okay. One city in the world you'd like to see before you die, right? For some of us, it's not about travel as much as it is life experiences. So for example, some of us will say, definitely graduating, either from high school or from college, university. That's something I want to have experienced before I die. For some of us, it's relational. To fall in love, maybe to marry, maybe to have children. Okay? Let's take a look at what it is Keats wants to do before he dies. Are you ready for this now? 885, when I have fears that I may cease to be. I'm going to start at 2b to help you know how to, first of all, read and then finally possibly memorize this sonnet. I'd like to point out that this is a sonnet that is intentionally constructed as a when, then sonnet. I'd write that down at 2b. This is an easy way to understand how this poem works. It is constructed in a when, then construction. All right? There's going to be three things that Keats is going to talk about he'd like to do before he dies. Let's now read the poem and see if we can figure it out. When I have fears that I may cease to be, before my pen has gleaned my teeming brain, before high-piled books and character hold like rich garners the full ripened grain, when I behold upon the night's starred face huge cloudy symbols of a high romance, and think that I may never live to trace their shadows with the magic hand of chance, and when I feel, fair creature of an hour, that I shall never look upon thee more, never have relish in the fairy power of unreflecting love, then on the shore of the wide world I stand alone and think, till love and fame to nothingness do sink. All right, let's go back and look at it. It's not a difficult poem at all. And once you kind of recognize what he's talking about, there's stuff I'm sad I'm not going to get to do before I die. Because he was already coughing up blood. In other words, he knew his end was coming. He knew he didn't have a decade. He knew he didn't have 10 years. He knew soon I'll be dead. And look what he says. When I have fears, it's a scary thing, that I may cease to be, I'm going to die. Look at the first thing that he's worried about. And this will shock some of you in the little list that you made. You probably maybe didn't put it there. Before I die, there's some books I'd like to read. Before I die, there's some writing I'd like to do. Can we just say out loud, one or two of us probably didn't put that on our list, right? We had other things on our list, but maybe not that, right? Okay? Notice for him, he has an interesting word picture, though, and because we live where we live, you'll get some sense of it. In the summer, when you're driving out north of town, for example, and you see those fields that are all that barley, do you know what I'm talking about? All that grain? Right before the grain is to be harvested, do you know what I'm talking about? And it looks like, it looks kind of like a beautiful, almost like a carpet or something, like a shag carpet that's got the, you know, when the wind blows it, it kind of moves it or whatever, right? Keats imagines each one of those heads of grain as a book he would like to read or a poem he would like to write that will never get harvested. Keats says that once he started coughing up blood, he hated going into libraries because he felt like the books were laughing at him because these were books he would never read before he died. This is the mentality. Take a look at how he says it. Before my pen has gleaned my, he calls it his teeming brain. Before high-piled books and character hold like rich garners the full ripened grain. One more time, he has a word picture of what it's like to read a good book. It's like cutting grain, harvesting a field, if you will. Look at the second thing he's worried about. When I behold upon the night's starred face huge cloudy symbols of a high romance, and think that I may never live to trace their shadows with the magic hand of chance. Now, what is this all about? Well, the word romance can throw us off. We will get to romance in the final when. Here, we're not so much talking about falling in love romance, as we're talking about the experiences where. Go back and look at the lines again. And when I behold upon the night's starred face huge cloudy symbols of a high romance. He's talking about being where. Now, romantics are all about this capital N word. Nature, you got it. This would be for those of you who wrote in your list, this would be the whole notion of travel or seeing things. In other words, Keats had some ambition to see the world. Didn't happen. Didn't happen. And I would say, as I often say to my students who grow up in a town of 5,000 people, that I often will say to students, you should try to see the world before you die. And I've often had students that say, what a waste of time that would be. And then I've taken those students places. And we've stood together, for example, in Rome and looked up at the Sistine Chapel. I've taken students from 303 there, and I stood with them. And one of those students had said to me, I didn't see any point of this trip. I figured I'd live and die within the Bighorn Basin. But now that I've seen this, I'm aware, I can't believe a human mind made this. It blows my mind, and now makes me think, maybe there's other places in the world I would like to see. Other things I would like to see. Some man-made. If you haven't stood next to the Grand Canyon, you should once in your life just to see it. If you haven't stood on the, for example, that ancient wall, that great wall that's built in China, that's a fascinating thing to see. These are sights that can only make you grow your imagination. And for Keats, he's like, bummer, I'm going to die before I get to see that. Look at the third one. Now, I didn't mention this in my biography because I was setting it up for this. Are you ready for this? It's maybe the most tragic thing of all. Keats has a girl. Yeah, I know, I'm speaking on the right day to talk about this. Keats has a girl. Are you ready for this? He loves her. She loves him. And in his day, it's pretty simple. I'll just go to her dad and say, I'm in love with your daughter, she's in love with me, can I marry? She comes from wealth and position. She does not care that he doesn't. So he's like, all right, goes to the dad. The dad says, no. So the girl has to say, no. So when he dies in Rome, he dies without his girl. And he dies with a broken heart. The reason for the broken heart is two. One, he knows she loves him. And two, he knows he'll never live long enough to be able to, change the dad's mind. Keats had the opinion that if only I could become famous, the dad would let me marry. And he was probably right. I mean, if Keats could have become famous over the next few years, the dad would have said, oh, okay, it's all right, it's all right. Not going to happen. Look at the last one. And when I feel, see, you totally know what this means now. And when I feel, fair creature of an hour, that I shall never look upon thee more. Never have relish in the fairy power of unreflecting love. In other words, I love, but I don't get any reflection back. So now we'll come back. See, we said it. Now we break it down one more, and we put it back together. He says, there's three things I'm bummed about I don't get to enjoy before I die. 1, reading and writing. 2, travel and seeing the world of nature. 3, my girl. My girl. I don't get to enjoy true love. He says, when I get really bummed about the fact that those three things for me don't get to happen, what is it that he does? I told you this is a when, then construction. What is it that he does? Well, there it is. Then, on the shore. See it? Of the wide world I stand alone and think, till love and fame to nothingness do sink. Now, this is an interesting word picture. He says, when I get really bummed about the fact that I don't get to read and write what I want. When I get really bummed about the fact that I don't get to travel and see the world of nature. When I get really bummed that my girl, I don't get to be with my girl because I'm going to die young. He says, when I get really bummed about all of that, I go out onto the edge of the universe. Are we talking literally or metaphorically? Metaphorically. Clearly metaphorically. And I look back on the world and I think long enough till love and fame to nothingness do sink. In other words, what's he saying? I try to convince myself that love and fame, I'm not going to miss them anymore. There's no big deal to that. Now, how do we know that him saying this was actually untrue? This comment about fame. How do we know that? What did he put on his tombstone? What words?
He said that he was going to be remembered.
Here lies one whose name was written in water. That's the words he put on his own tombstone, telling us fame and being remembered for him was something he really did want. What's the irony of all ironies? Go ahead and write it down. What's the irony of all ironies about Keats and fame? Yeah, he did become very, very famous, right? Of course, it was just fame after his death, right? Not fame during his lifetime. Let's now turn to the first of 2 odes of Keats. You're going to be writing on these odes and examining over these odes, so we want to make sure. The first place I want to begin is at 2b. And we want to point out what an ode is. An ode is a poem of tribute to an object normally a non-human object, okay? It's a poem of tribute or praise. Jot down at 3A. What's an ode we already looked at that's important? Do you remember? What's one?
Westminster.
You got it. Who wrote it?
Byron?
No.
Shelley.
Shelley, good. Byron's ode came in the form of an apostrophe, and his ode was to the what? Byron's ode. Do you remember? His apostrophe to the ocean. Good. It's a little bit different from an ode. An ode is a little bit more closed kind of form, but I'm kind of helping you get a sense of what we're about to look at. Wait a minute. Shelley had another ode. Do you remember? And when I read it, I said that 2 different times that window was open and our ode reading was interrupted. Do you remember? It was an ode to the skylark, right, and to the song of that bird. Do you remember that? Now that is Shelley. Keats, a contemporary of Shelley, writes also an ode to a bird, only his bird is not to the songbird of the day, but the songbird of the night, the nightingale, okay? That's a bird that sings at night. Have you noticed this? Most birds don't sing at night. There are only a few that sing at night, and the nightingale is one of them. Read with me on page 886 real quickly. There's a bit of background here. Keats composed this ode in, you want to write this down, 1819. Living in a place called Hampstead with his friend Charles Brown. Brown wrote the following description about how the ode was composed. You'll find this interesting. See, because Keats dies young, we don't have a lot of this kind of information from Keats. We have it from his pals, from people who hung out with him, because Keats was very reluctant in his life to share much of his poetry. So he would go off and write, and then he would hide it someplace. The poetry, much of it was found after his death. Take a look. In the spring of 1819, a nightingale had built her nest near my house. Keats felt a tranquil and continued joy in her song. And one morning, he took his chair from the breakfast table to the grass plot under the plum tree, where he sat for 2 or 3 hours. When he came into the house, I perceived he had some scraps of paper in his hand, and these he was quietly thrusting behind the books. On inquiry, I found those scraps, 4 or 5 in number, contained his poetic feeling on the song of our nightingale. Got me? So in other words, he hears the song, he goes out, and then he writes this set of lines. Let's go to 2B. What am I going to say at 2B you should probably pay attention to as we read this? At 2B. That, remember, 2B is rhetoric, not what the poem says, but how it says it. Do you see it? What do I see? Roman. You got it. See, by this point, this ought to become instinctive to you. Anytime a poem is broken up with these Roman numerals, we're going to write those Roman numerals down. How many of them are there? See? So you want to know this. How many Roman numerals are there? How many stanzas of this poem are there? Right. There are 8 of these, aren't there? Right? And so we'll want to pay attention. Notice each stanza will have a certain kind of configuration. For example, notice how many lines. Do you see it?
10.
Each one, 10 lines. Do you see it? Notice there's a certain kind of rhyme scheme. Pains, drains, drunk, sunk. Do you see it? See how that works? Okay. And so there's some lot, plot. Do you see that? So there's an in rhyme as well. So in other words, Keats is doing a lot of poetic things as he is working within this ode. All right? Finally, let's jot down a couple of things here before we go to the reading of this poem. Okay? I want to begin with the term negative capability. Negative capability. That's a term you want to write down. Keats liked this term. Although we're not sure he invented this term, he certainly liked this term. What does it mean, negative capability? The capacity or the ability of a poet to negate himself or herself and enter fully into his or her subject so as to represent it with an especially rich and vibrant objectivity. In other words, negative capability would be for you to literally in your mind imagine being Ruthie's tree. In other words, you are Ruthie's tree looking at you right now sitting in room 303. And then writing from that capacity. What would it be like to be X, Y, or Z? That is negative capability. In other words, you negate yourself. You're no longer who you are, and you try to completely become that. Do you got me? Right? So, for example, you can play this game in any number of ways. Some of you, for example, as children, maybe played the game of what would it be like to be the floating cloud. Remember, we have that reference already in Shelley's Ode to the West Wind, to be something other than what you are. What would it be like to be the bird? What would it be like to be the butterfly? Whatever. Children play this game all the time, right? All right, what about this poem? In this poem, notice Keats, the speaker, subsumes himself into the joyous nightingale and so transcends the pain of the mortal world. In other words, the bird will symbolize exit. But wait a minute. Keats already is aware by 1819 of what kind of potential exit for him. You've got it. Death at a younger age, right? So as we pay attention, look at the opening lines. My heart, see? There it is, right? My heart aches, and drowsy numbness pains my sense, as though of hemlock I had drunk. All right? Now I'm going to have you listen to this poem by a professional reader, and while we read, I'm assuming you already read this once before. You want to pay attention to each one of the different parts. What is it that he's being focused on in each one of the 8 different parts? All right, here we go. Song of the Nightingale by John Keats.
To a Nightingale by John Keats. My heart aches, and a drowsy numbness pains my sense, as though of hemlock I had drunk, or emptied some dull opiate to the drains 1 minute past, and lethe ones had sunk. 'Tis not through envy of thy happy lot, but being too happy in thine happiness, that thou, light-winged dryad of the trees, in some melodious plot of beechen green and shadows numberless, singest of summer in full-throated ease. Oh, for a draught of vintage that hath been cooled a long age in the deep-delved earth, tasting of flora and the country green, dance and Provençal song and sunburnt mirth. Oh, for a beaker full of the warm south, full of the true, the blushful hippocrene, with beaded bubbles winking at the brim and purple-stained mouth, that I might drink and leave the world unseen, and with thee fade away into the forest dim. Fade far away, dissolve, and quite forget what thou among the leaves hast never known. The weariness, the fever, and the fret, here where men sit and hear each other groan, where palsy shakes a few sad last grey hairs, where youth grows pale and spectre thin and dies, where but to think is to be full of sorrow and leaden-eyed despairs, where beauty cannot keep her lustrous eyes, or new love pine at them beyond tomorrow. Away, away, for I will fly to thee, not charioted by Bacchus and his pards, but on the viewless wings of poesy, though the dull brain perplexes and retards, already with thee. Tender is the night, and haply the queen moon is on her throne, clustered around by all her starry fays. But here there is no light, save what from heaven is with the breezes blown, through verdurous glooms and winding mossy ways. I cannot see what flowers are at my feet, nor what soft incense hangs upon the boughs, but in embalmed darkness guess each sweet wherewith the seasonable month endows the grass, the thicket, and the fruit tree wild, white hawthorn, and the pastoral eglantine. Fast fading violets covered up in leaves, and mid-May's eldest child, the coming musk rose, full of dewy wine, the murmurous haunt of flies on summer eves. Darkling I listen, and for many a time I have been half in love with easeful death, called him soft names in many a mused rhyme, to take into the air my quiet breath. Now more than ever seems it rich to die, to cease upon the midnight with no pain, while thou art pouring forth thy soul abroad in such an ecstasy. Still wouldst thou sing, and I have ears in vain, to thy high requiem become a sod. Thou wast not born for death, immortal bird. No hungry generations tread thee down. The voice I hear this passing night was heard in ancient days by emperor and clown. Perhaps the self-same song that found a path through the sad heart of Ruth, when sick for home she stood in tears amid the alien corn. The same that oft times hath charmed magic casements, opening on the foam of perilous seas in fairy lands forlorn. Forlorn. The very word is like a bell to toll me back from thee to my sole self. Adieu. The fancy cannot cheat so well as she is famed to do, deceiving elf. Adieu, adieu. Thy plaintive anthem fades past the near meadows, over the still stream, up the hillside, and now 'tis buried deep in the next valley glades. Was it a vision or a waking dream? Fled is that music. Do I wake or sleep?
Notice the last word of this poem. What is the last word of
Ode
this
on a
poem?
Grecian Urn
Right?
by John Keats.
Let's go ahead and just study now a little bit about that last word. What do you make of that last word in regards to this poem? And notice that there is a question mark there, huh? Right? So the question that Keats is going to end this poem with is the question of,
To be or not.
what's the word that gets used at least 3 times in that last part? What's that word? Do you know that word?
I do.
Yeah, what is that word? What does it mean?
Goodbye.
It does mean goodbye, doesn't it? Adieu means goodbye, right? As in time to go away. So notice how this poem begins with early evening and then ends with the actual darkness of night and the word sleep and the word adieu, and back to the end line of part 2 and the first line of part 3, the word fade. What does that word mean? Fade. To fade means to what? Go away. Good. To start to become removed in some way. So this is a poem. How would you? I mean, you've read it, so just qualify it in level 1. This is a poem, a dumb poem about what? I mean, you could just reduce it to one line that says what? It's a poem where somehow there's an identification with the song of the Nightingale, but it's a different kind of identification than Shelley's, right? A song to the skylark, or to the skylark, right? It's a different kind of poem because it's a poem that's a little more, what's the adjectives you want to use? Somber, quiet, sullen, gloomy, unaware maybe, completely unaware of what's going on. See, we can now annotate this poem very, very quickly. At level 1. Notice at part 1, he starts out by saying that his heart aches. Drowsy numbness pains him. Notice he says in the second one, a draught of vintage. Man, I'd like to just get seriously drunk off some wine. And then being drunk in wine, it's like going to sleep, which is like what? Yeah, it is kind of like just lying back and dying. You get the sense that Keats maybe has some physical pain in his body as he's writing this. In other words, wouldn't it be nice if it would just go away? Fade away. Notice what he says at in part 3. Fade away, far away. Dissolve and quite forget what thou among the leaves have never known. What is it that birds don't know? This sounds a lot like Shelley, doesn't it? The weariness, the fever, and the fret. It's interesting that he would use the weariness and the fever. Those are words that are used by Wordsworth in Tintern Abbey, who says, when the fever has hung upon the beatings of my heart, how oft have I turned to thee, O sylvan why? Notice he says, where but to think, this world, but to think is full of sorrow. Noticed a few minutes ago, when I asked you to actually write down 3 things you want to do before you die, some of you could not do that. Some of you didn't even want to think about that. Why? Look at the line you just read. In this world, to think is to be what? Full of sadness, sorrow. Dude, I don't want to make a list of the things I got to do before I die. That reminds me that I've got to die. I don't want to think about that. Every time we start thinking, he says, we inevitably come to some kind of sorrow. Do you remember what Shelley said about the songbird? The happier we laugh, the reason we laugh so hard is what? Right. Behind that laughter is the sadness that this moment must someday go away. Notice in part 4 on page 888, tender is the night. This, of course, a very famous line, gets used in a number of songs and the like. Embalmed darkness, section 5, right? I cannot see what flowers are at my feet. Night is coming on. Light is leaving. Things are going away. Notice part 6. Darkling, dark. In other words, I listen, and for many a time I've been half in love with easeful death. Now, line 55, more than ever seems it rich to die, to cease upon the midnight with no pain. In other words, if I've got to die, I hope I go
Easy.
right, without a lot of pain. Because when your lungs start going away, it can be very, very painful death. And he says, easeful death. Notice the feeling of this poem is kind of like, right? Then, part 7, pure ode here. Why pure ode? Thou. The word thou is the word you. Who is he speaking directly to? You're right, he's speaking directly to that nightingale. Thou wast not born for death, immortal bird. No hungry generations tread thee down. Hungry generations? It's as if Keats is suggesting that people have tread him down, walked on him, said his poetry wasn't any good. He identifies with a bird. Wouldn't it be great if birds don't get judged? They are what they are. But he clearly feels that. And then he makes an interesting observation. The same sound that I'm hearing now is the sound that was heard for thousands of years before me by any number of people, both really wealthy and powerful people, emperors, and nobodies, clowns. Everybody's heard this song. In other words, he's kind of convincing him about death, that death is what? It is the great mediator. Yeah, that's a great way to say it. It's kind of like what we said about Hamlet, right? Everybody goes, and it doesn't matter whether you're a big shot or a nobody, a clown or an emperor, right? Finally, forlorn. In other words, the very word is a bell to toll me back from thee to my soul self. Notice the word soul means here not S-O-U-L, but what? S-O-L-E means what? Alone, alone, alone. That's the word. In other words, Keats will identify. I'm all by myself here. I'm going to do this project all alone. Soul, right? All alone. I got nobody else to go with me on this one. Notice he says, adieu. The fancy cannot cheat so well as she is famed to do. Deceiving elf, adieu, adieu. Thy plaintive anthem fades. That word again, fade. Past the near meadows, over the still stream, up the hillside, and now the song of the bird is going away in the same way that he identifies what? He also is going away. Right. In other words, as your body begins to break down, inevitably you start to kind of recognize soon it will all be over. Notice he says, finally, was it a vision or a waking dream? Fled is that music. The word fled, like the word fade. All of the tones of this poem then, how do you want to qualify it in the end? It's solemn, isn't it? It's kind of sad, isn't it? You got a really young kid. I mean, think about this. Are you ready for this? This will blow your mind. He wrote this poem in what? You wrote it down. What date? 819. Now just flip back really quickly to page 881. And he was born in 1795. Right? What's 19 plus 5? 24. Right? He will die, correct? See how that works? So in other words, at the age of 24, he already knows, this is a done deal for me. I'm leaving. I'm going away. I hope that it will be easy. I hope that it won't be hard. Kind of like the songbird's departure, right? This is pretty heavy stuff for a young kid, would you agree? And yet, it was kind of forced on him. It wasn't like he wanted to choose this. I mean, he didn't have a choice, right? All right, there you go. 2 more offerings of Keats.